London is something of a leftist enclave, like many metropolitan areas. New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Brighton, Bristol, and Seattle spring to mind. And as such, the largely leftist inhabitants of that city consider themselves more sophisticated, more worldly, better informed than dull suburbanites or simplistic country yokels. That's just a conceit, of course. The reality is such cities are rather smug bubbles of narrow-minded and self-righteous conceit. And while I certainly don't want to tar all inhabitants with the same brush, such traits are certainly very common. We saw this in the 2019 election, when London voted virtually as one for the insufferable Jeremy Corbyn. And they've also twice picked the unutterably awful Sadiq Khan as their mayor. It's difficult to know where to begin with how dreadful Khan is. Here's a man who has no problem with the burqa, but who banned adverts with bikinis from the London Underground. Almost like our Muslim mayor somehow mistook Clapham for Riyadh, or Islamabad. He's also spent thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money forcing adverts for the horrific activists of Black Lives Matter in everyone's faces. And that campaign perhaps showed him at his worst. Khan had, of course, jumped wholesale onto the Unthinking Covid bandwagon and spouted all the face mask, lockdown, social distancing drivel that was the requisite of the unthinking conformists who believe themselves to be critical thinking sophisticates. But he made an exception to that for the BLM riots. Suddenly, all his political kin were exempt from the restrictions imposed on everyone else, and exempt from the rules of law and order too. An orgy of rioting and vandalism ripped through London. Yet the police were basically stood down, even though the mobs were responding to events in Minneapolis, some 5,000 miles away. In fact, Khan enthusiastically joined in the iconoclasms, announcing the establishment of a commission that would adjudicate on London's monuments, that would determine which statues should be ripped down next. His focus, naturally, was on slavery. Except, as a Muslim, Khan has spent his entire life worshipping a slaver. Inconsistencies like these don't bother him, though, because woke activism is driven by platitudes and feelings, not reason, logic, or evidence. And it's also driven by deep inconsistency, one of the keystones of left-wing activism. The BLM mob had been given carte blanche to run riot, but when there was a right-wing protest shortly afterwards, the response was rather different. Andrew Banks, unlike the BLM mob, didn't vandalise a statue. He merely urinated next to one. But there was no exemption for him. He was sent to jail. And these fantastic double standards were repeated in Bristol when a mob ripped down a statue of Edward Colston, dragged it through the streets, and hurled it in the harbour. There was no conviction for them either, though. They were simply let off, because they'd been offended that a man born in 1636 lived in a period with different rules. And their campaign to vandalise art was sponsored by Banksy, because of course it was. Those BLM riots saw more of these marvellous leftist inconsistencies. When photos of police officer Ruby Begum circulated, a few people sardonically wondered where her face mask was. And of course, all the leftists who had been screaming, "Wear the damn mask," for months, leapt to her defence, because their opinions are determined entirely by race. So she was praised as stunning and brave, and defying conventions by flouting uniform rules. Of course, her courage might have been aided by the posse of burly men surrounding her, but inconveniently for the left, it soon emerged that Miss Begum had a history of appalling racist abuse, denouncing white people as kafar, Jews as scumbags, and Pakistanis as Pakis. She was also in correspondence with a member of ISIS who is in favour of the group's use of Yazidi rape camps. The left didn't have much to say about that, and as usual, they didn't learn from their mistakes or accept any humility. Anyway, back to Mayor Khan. Now, perhaps the most shockingly egregious aspect of Khan's tenure has been his reaction to terrorist attacks. When a mosque was attacked in Christchurch, New Zealand by Brenton Tarrant, Khan called a press conference and gave a heartfelt response, talking about how he stood in solidarity with the people of New Zealand. He spoke of his sorrow and of his brothers and sisters in Christchurch. He singled out the fact that the victims were targeted because of their faith. He condemned those who fan the flames of hatred, those who demonise and dehumanise people because of their religion. He went on that our diversity is a strength. We celebrate it, we embrace it, and we respect it. He seemed to imply that people who didn't take that vocal stance played a role in radicalising others to become terrorists. Yet when there was an Islamic terror attack in his own city, Khan rather brushed it off as part and parcel of city life. It's odd that he's so sympathetic when Muslims are the victims of an attack, but rather dismissive when they're the perpetrators. I have no idea why the Muslim mayor of London takes that stand, or why he shows more concern for killings 11,000 miles away than for murders that happen in his own jurisdiction. But it's also notable that Khan, who highlighted the faith of the victims in Christchurch, saw no reason to bring up the faith of the terrorists in London. He had no comment on how the London terrorists demonised and dehumanised people because of their religion. There were no allegations that somehow fundamental Islam might play a role in radicalising people to become terrorists, the very same allegation he had made about Christchurch. There have been 6 Islamic terror attacks in London on Khan's watch. 15 people dead, many more wounded. And not a word from the mayor as strong as those he'd uttered about New Zealand. You can draw your own conclusions on what that says about his true sympathies. And his sympathies were brought into question again over the Kaaba case. Kaaba was a young black man, a member of a London gang. He'd recorded a number of raps bragging about his taste for stabbing people. He was driving a stolen car that had been involved in a shooting, and he ran from the police. He then rammed some police cars and drove his car at high speed directly at some officers. That's when he was shot. Sadiq Khan expressed great sympathy at this intensely difficult time, but his heartfelt sympathy was for Kaaba, not for the police. Of the police, who had nearly been killed in carrying out their duties, he expressed concerns and launched a homicide investigation. Khan said, "I fully understand the grave concerns and impact of Chris's death on black Londoners across our city, and the anger, pain and fear it has caused, as well as the desire for justice and change. I appreciate there are many unanswered questions, and I want to reassure all of London's communities that I will continue to push for those to be answered." But he had no support at all for the constabulary, and never suggested that maybe gangsters shouldn't stab and shoot people while attempting to ram the police. And I suspect Khan wouldn't have given the same heartfelt response if it had been a white thug in question. And this brings us to another issue we must discuss with Khan. When he forced out the Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, Khan said that she hadn't done enough to tackle racism, misogyny, homophobia, Islamophobia, etc. In fact, Dick's problem was that she had obsessed over the likes of racism and homophobia, and like Khan, had completely neglected the issue of crime. Because under our incompetent mayor, London has seen a devastating rise in knife crime. Under Khan, there have been, according to the latest Met statistics, 774 murders, a total that's rising all the time. Yet this is an issue that doesn't seem to concern him much, despite the fact that he's largely to blame. Khan put pressure on the police to halt the practice of stop and search, because like a lot of leftists, he'd seem to prefer it if young black men were being stabbed to death, as long as he can grandstand about not being a racist. It's a terrible dereliction of duty, and of all his gross misconduct and dreadful failures, it's the worst stain on his record. Let's look briefly at just one of these cases. Levi Ernest Morrison had called at the house of Tyrese Ulysses in Catford on a number of occasions. Ulysses' mother, Nicola Layton, 36, became agitated at these intrusions. She screamed that she would batter the boys, so she drove her son and 2 other lads out, all armed with knives, looking for Levi. When the gang came across Levi, who was from a rival gang, they stabbed him to death. All 3 boys were jailed, as was Nicola Layton, who will serve a minimum of 23 years. Endless cases like this have mushroomed under Khan's governance. Yet he still seems to be popular with Londoners. Like I say, a lot of smug self-satisfaction there, but not too much attention to consequences and evidence. I mean, I've heard that Jeremy Corbyn might have a run at London Mayor, and they're so delusional, they'll probably vote for him as well. If you want to support this channel, please like, subscribe, and think about buying my books. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they go into topics like this in much greater detail. They're available on the links below. Please do feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.